Hey guys, I'm Mr. Mills, and today we're going to be talking about the inverses from section 1.2. Okay, so remember an inverse is something that essentially undoes something, right? So it undoes another operation, undoes an operation, right? And so we really talked about two different types of inverses. We had the additive inverse and we had the multiplicative inverse, right? So we can think that the additive inverse kind of relates to addition and subtraction, right? Whereas the multiplicative inverse relates to multiplication and division, of course, okay? And so the idea of an additive inverse is trying to think if you were to add two numbers together, your goal is you want them to equal 0, right? So your goal is that you want them to equal 0, right? And so if two numbers, when you add them together, equal 0, then that means those two numbers are additive inverses of each other. So some examples of what an additive inverse might be, and let's do, if I put out a random number, let's say I did 7 as just one number. If I'm trying to find the additive inverse of 7, then of course I'm trying to think in my head, 7 plus what gets me 0? Well, it's just the opposite of 7, right? And so the answer would be -7. 7 and -7 are additive inverses of each other because if you were to add them together, you would get 0, okay? And so maybe another example would be, what if I had 2/3, right? If I had 2/3 and I'm trying to find the additive inverse of 2/3, well, basically I'm just thinking 2/3 plus what gets me 0? Well, the answer would be -2/3, okay? And so essentially what we can see is in order to find the additive inverse of something, you are going to need to switch the sign, right? And so we started with +7, then the additive inverse would be -7. We started with +2/3, then the additive inverse would be -2/3. If I did one more quick example on what an additive inverse would be, let's say I start with, I don't know, how about -9/2? What would the additive inverse of -9/2 be? Well, you know, it's just -9/2 plus what gets me 0? Well, I'm just going to flip the sign, right? So the additive inverse of -9/2 would be +9/2. Okay? And so those are all examples of additive inverses. Now, multiplicative inverses, very similar, right? They're still opposites, but your goal here, instead of getting them to equal 0, your goal here is you want them to equal 1. So when you're finding multiplicative inverses, you're trying to find two numbers that when you multiply them together, they equal 1, right? And so let's start with how about, let's do 1/7. What's the multiplicative inverse of 1/7? Okay, well, essentially what I'm going to do is 1/7 times what gets me 1. Well, hey, since I have a fraction here, all I'm going to do is I'm going to flip the old fraction, and instead of having 1/7, I'll have 7/1, right? Which of course is just 7, right? Because anything divided by 1 is just itself. Okay? And so the multiplicative inverse of 1/7 is just 7th. And the reason behind that is because 1/7 times 7 is just 1, right? And that's the whole goal of finding a multiplicative inverses, is finding the other number, right? Finding two numbers where if you multiply those two guys together, you get 1, okay? And so what if I had what if I had, I don't know, 3 halves? What if I'm finding the multiplicative inverse of 3 halves? Okay, well, what I'm going to do is, hey, I'm just going to flip the fraction. Instead of having 3 halves, I'll have 2/3. Okay, and then those two numbers, 3 halves and 2/3, are multiplicative inverses of each other, because really I'm just kind of flipping the fraction. Okay, and then maybe one last one. What if I had, let's do negative 4. If I'm finding the multiplicative inverse of -4, okay, well, first of all, I'm going to keep that negative there, and then I'm going to flip the fraction essentially on 4. Well, remember 4 is basically 4 divided by 1, right? And so instead of having 4 divided by 1, I'll have 1 divided by 4. Okay? And so the multiplicative inverse of -4 is -1/4. Okay, so really what I'm looking at here is when I'm finding multiplicative inverses, I am going to keep the sign, and I'm going to flip the fraction. Okay, and so since this was negative, that means this one's going to be negative. This was positive, that means that's going to be positive. Positive, that means that one's going to be positive. Okay, so I'm going to keep the sign, and I'm going to flip the fraction. And that's all for this time.